Couple of just thank yous to get out there before I introduce our panelists. So first I wanted to thank the CLCE and the Wilson Fund for supporting the event, generously providing the lunch for us from Anna's. And also wanted to thank the CPLA and the College Democrats and the College Republicans who've been really great co-organizers and supporters of a lot of the events related to the election that are going on this fall. Wanted to make sure everybody knew that next week, Tuesday night, when the election happens, that this is the place to be to watch the election returns roll in. If it's close, as it's projected to be close, it could be a long night, but there'll be a lot of food, and this will be a fun and festive atmosphere to take in the election results. So please come back here on Tuesday night. We've had a couple of earlier faculty panel discussions that focused on some of the issues in the election, the domestic issues and the foreign policy issues, but here we are, less than a week to go, and the race is extremely tight, as everybody knows. And so at the end of the day, it may come down to some of the issues, some of the things that our panelists are going to be able to elucidate for us, things like who's got a better ground game, or what difference does money really make in a campaign. With a race this tight, every little, those aren't little things, but everything like that could end up making the decisive difference. So I'm delighted that we have so much wonderful faculty expertise to draw on this topic. So we have 4 panelists. Let me introduce them briefly in the order in which they'll be presenting. So first we have Chris Baylor of the Political Science Department. Next, Hahrie Han, also of the Political Science Department. Third, we'll have Tom Cushman of the Sociology Department. And finally, Marion Just of Political Science. So thank you all so much for joining us. And with no further ado, let me let Chris lead it off.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm glad my handout didn't scare people away. There's a little bit of math in my handout, but I'll try to keep it brief and painless. So first, let me contrast the perspective of journalists and the perspective of political scientists. Journalists, when they're covering a campaign, tend to treat it like a race where one candidate's getting ahead and then another candidate passes him. So, there's a gaffe here, a gaffe there, a commercial here, a commercial there, a good slogan, a bad slogan. And the decisions of the candidates and the campaigns are what determine the outcome. Or at least that's the impression you get if you read journalists about the election. But political scientists like to look for patterns. They like to look to past elections to predict into future elections, and we have in fact found structural variables that play a huge role in the election no matter what the campaigns do. It's not that what the campaigns do, their slogans, their gaffes don't have an effect, but that the campaigns all have the best advisors that money can buy, and they largely counteract each other. You might be able to get some advantages from campaigns, but political scientists are apt to generalize across elections and find structural features that to some extent the candidates have no control over. And so what we've found that affects the election the most is the economy. Since World War II, we found a very strong finding that the better the economy is, the better the incumbent president does. Or if the incumbent is not running, the better that the incumbent president parties will do in that election. And so if you look at the handout that I provided, you can see a range of presidents and presidential candidates from McCain with one of the lower points of the economy to Reagan in '84 with one of the highest economic performances. And just looking at that, you can see that the better the economy is, here it's measured by percent growth in non-farm payrolls, the better the incumbent party share of the two-party vote. So notice they're not all incumbents on this. At the left of this graph, you see McCain, 08. Now McCain wasn't the incumbent president, but he was the incumbent party presidential candidate. Bush was the incumbent, he's a Republican, McCain's a Republican. So you see they're not all exactly on this line. If this were a hard science, we could get a bunch of findings that all fit exactly on a line. We'd have an exact relationship. So this is an inexact relationship, but nonetheless, the economy here explains 50% of the variation in the votes. That's huge. And statisticians can show you that the chance that you get a pattern like this just by coincidence is less than 1%. So this is one of the strongest findings we've ever had in social science. So yes, you have candidates coming up with good slogans and having gaffes, but the economy is always present there. Now, the way to think about this is the economy creates a sort of baseline, and that you can, if the economy is working in your favor, you can blow it if you run a really bad campaign. Al Gore, for example, in 2000, lost, and one of the reasons we think he might have lost was he didn't emphasize the economy. So this model assumes that if the economy works in your favor, you're going to be emphasizing it. Well, Al Gore didn't want to tie himself too closely to Bill Clinton because he didn't know how that would turn out, and so he might not have run on the past 8 years as much as he might have. Now, one interesting thing about this election is that we have a president who inherited a recession, and the question is, are voters going to give him a grace period because of that? I think voters do understand that the depression, recession, whatever you want to call it, started before Obama, but on the other hand, do they have the expectation that he should have fixed it by now? I think it's Obama has had to sell the message that yeah, things could be a lot better, but things would be even worse if the other party won. And I think that's a very tough message to sell, and all things considered, I think he's done pretty well with it. And I think Romney has not done as well as you might expect in discrediting the incumbent party based on that. He's tried to say, you know, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, it hasn't really been sticking for Romney the way it stuck for Reagan when Reagan ran against Carter in 1980. And Romney's also been saying, you know, have the last 4 years have been good to you? What makes you think that the next 4 years are going to be anything different? And Obama is able to come back and say, well, if you go with Romney, you're going to be working for people with a relatively extreme agenda. So Romney, I think, has been an unusually weak presidential candidate in making the economy stick to Obama. That being said, Obama's ratings in the poll right now are about what you'd expect. Based on the economy, I've seen estimates that he'll get between 47 and 51% of the vote, of the popular vote. And I'm really confident that it's going to be there. Of course, the difference between 49% and 50% is huge. And by the way, you can also make predictions about Congress based on the economy. Remember, my statistics professor in 2006 predicted that the Democrats would gain 26 seats that year. They wound up gaining 31 seats. He made that prediction early in September before we knew about Mark Foley. Mark Foley, a Republican congressman from Florida who got involved in a sex scandal, and that might have been the biggest item in the news that fall. So he came very close to predicting it. This year I've seen predictions that the House is going to lose 10 Democrats based on the economy. There are some other variables that matter. Some people think that in addition to measuring the economy, you should incorporate whether the president's an incumbent or not. Other people also think that you should include whether we're at war or not and how many American casualties there are. And there again, you have to wonder about a grace period. How much are Americans going to judge Obama on foreign policy when he inherited 2 wars from his predecessor? Finally, some people think you should include race. We've only had one African-American presidential candidate with a chance of winning, and that's not enough to make a generalization about. Now, if you look at McCain did better, was above the line on this graph. So McCain did better than expected, and I think a pretty good explanation is in fact race. Seth Maskett at the University of Colorado Boulder has looked at surveys on the impact of race for Democrats running for statewide positions. And based on that, he predicted that Obama would, on balance, lose 2% of the vote in 2008. And so that would come pretty close to explaining why McCain did better than expected. Now, one thing that isn't on this and that probably shouldn't be included is character. My advisor actually showed this graph to Bill Clinton in 1996. Bill Clinton called a group of political scientists to help him get reelected, and my advisor showed him this graph, and he said, you know, don't spook the bond market, don't blow this election. The economy is working in your favor. And Clinton looked at this graph for 15 seconds, folded it up and put it in his pocket and started dozing off for the rest of the presentation. But an hour later, he asked questions and asked my advisor, tell me, is there a role for presidential character in all this? And my advisor said, you could look at this graph for an awfully long time and find no evidence that good character matters. So, for example, most people think Nixon had a very bad character. People think the same thing about Lyndon Johnson or LBJ, and both of them did better than expected. So character doesn't seem to play a strong role. Now, on to my point about Romney being an unusually weak nominee. So usually parties nominate the strongest candidate they can. So why are the Republicans stuck with Romney, given all the opportunities of this election? We've had the worst economy since Franklin Roosevelt, and you'd think that qualified Republicans would have been jumping at the chance to challenge Obama. Not only that, but this is the second election in a row where I feel like the Republicans have come up with a weak candidate in the sense that they haven't found a candidate that can unite their party. In 2008, you also had John McCain, who is very unpopular with certain wings of the party. So why, twice in a row, have we had fairly weak Republican nominees? One explanation is just coincidence. It's just happened to be twice in a row where the Republicans just don't have great candidates. Maybe a few years from now, they could nominate Chris Christie or Marco Rubio, who would probably be stronger than McCain or Romney. But another explanation is that the Republicans have had a hard time because their coalition is very fractured. First of all, even the Tea Party is fractured. I've seen estimates that about 50% of the Tea Party are Christian conservatives and 50% are not, so there's a difference of emphasis there. But there's also the division between Tea Party Republicans and kind of non-ideological Republicans. Republicans that like to solve problems one day at a time, like the kind of George H.W. Bush Republicans. And furthermore, the Republicans have economic conservatives, social conservatives, and foreign policy conservatives. McCain really only had the foreign policy conservatives in his corner. And I think, like, in the general election, he couldn't veer back to the center, the way most nominees do in the general election, because he felt so insecure about his conservative credentials. And this time around, I think Romney really didn't satisfy any of those kinds of conservatives. And so you had the bizarre spectacle of the Republicans shifting their focus on one candidate a month at a time. So Michelle Bachmann had her day in the sun. They thought, okay, maybe Michelle Bachmann can be the conservative alternative to Romney. But she had all these gaffes and proved to be a little bit of a Sarah Palin in terms of what she knew in politics. Then there was Herman Cain. They looked at Herman Cain, and then there was the sexual harassment scandal, and also he didn't seem to know too much about foreign policy. And then there was Rick Perry, who proved in the debates that he was not going to be presidential material. And finally, the last person standing who could be a conservative alternative to Romney was Rick Santorum. Rick Santorum was probably too socially conservative for the American public, and I mean, not only would he not win because of that, but he might drag down congressional Republicans with him. But nonetheless, he was the only conservative alternative to Romney at the end, and I'll note that when he did win, he mainly won in low turnout states. Now, if Romney loses and next time around there's Marco Rubio or Chris Christie, I feel like those people could unify kind of the pragmatic Republicans and the Tea Party Republicans in a way that Romney could not. Now, if Romney wins, I think he's going to have a terrible time as president. Right now, the conservatives are sort of united behind him because they want to unseat Romney. But that's not going to last when he's in office. When in office, he's going to be conflicted over to fulfill the Mitt Romney of the Republican primaries or the Mitt Romney of the general election. And right now, conservative activists are fine to let him run on his record as governor of Massachusetts as a moderate. They are not going to let him do that if they control Congress. In fact, they might try to pass the Paul Ryan budget, which is different from Mitt Romney's budget, and that will put him in a very tough position. And I think that that's just going to happen for all 4 years or potentially 8 years of a Romney presidency. He's never going to be able to satisfy his own party. And if you can't hold your own party together as president, you're not going to be able to get off the ground. A further sign of Romney's weakness, I think, is his focus on technical competence. That he's a good manager and he can run things more efficiently. And I think generally is a sign of desperation. It's a sign that you really don't have that your party base doesn't have enough popularity that you can run on an issue that's popular among your party base, that you have to go for something that sort of appeals to everybody. You saw the same thing with Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter. Both of them tried to run on their managerial expertise and technical competence at a time when their party ideologies were declining. And they sounded the death knell for their party. Really, after Hoover and after Carter, the other party was really the more potent party for quite a bit longer. And so I think if Romney is elected president, that will be the unraveling of the Republican Party, that the Republican Party will become even more fractured than it is now, and Romney will be hopeless to bring it back together. Things won't be great for Obama either if he wins re-election. I think that Obama, he will almost certainly face divided government for all 4 years. Right now it looks like the House will win the Republicans will win the House for the first 2 years. And then in the midterm elections, the president's party almost always lose seats in Congress, and he's only hanging on to the Senate by a thread. So I would be surprised if Barack Obama won, if he would get even one major legislative initiative through, and certainly not more than one. So if any of you are wild enough to throw an election based on a political science theory, I think that Democrats should be hoping that Romney wins because that will unravel the Republican Party, and Republicans should be hoping that Obama wins because that will give more time for resentment against Obama to build up, and 4 years later they'll have a stronger candidate in Marco Rubio, Chris Christie, or one of them.
So I just want to reinforce a point that Professor Baylor was making about the importance of the economy. There's an economist at Yale named Ray Fair who does many things, but one of the things he does is he predicts presidential elections. And he has a model for predicting presidential election outcomes that's based purely on what's going on with the economy. So like Professor Baylor said, we know nothing about who the candidates are, nothing about Monica Lewinsky, nothing about anything else that's going on about the debates, everything that could possibly affect the horse race. All we know is how the economy is doing. And he measures the state of the economy based on a number of factors, including things like inflation, how many quarters of GDP growth we've had during the incumbent party's past 4 years. And what this graph shows basically is the black line shows the Democratic vote share that we actually had from 1916 through 2008, and the dotted line shows what his model predicted. Okay, and so what you should do is look at that and gasp, okay? Because what you see is that there's it's markedly close, right? By knowing nothing else about what's going on in the election, he's able to pretty accurately predict what was going to happen in all these different elections. And as of yesterday, his latest update is based on the economic data that we have now. The incumbent party, which would be Obama, is predicted to get 49% of the vote. Okay, but that's 49, and so his argument is that right now the election's too close to call, because 49%, there's some error around that. And the other thing to remember is that these models are based on the national vote total, whereas the actual president, as I'm sure many of you know, is chosen by the Electoral College, right? And so it's very possible, the election that we have right now is so close, it's very possible that Obama could in fact win 49% of the vote, but then still win the election by winning certain key states. So this is just to reinforce Chris's point. But what I want to talk about is a couple different myths about this election that have been pervasive, I think, in the way the media has been reporting this election, and just show you some data behind them. So the first one is the idea that the first debate potentially could have cost Obama the race. So I don't know if you all remember the first debates when Obama and Romney were up there, and Obama seemed relatively catatonic. He seemed to not be responding to a lot of the things that Romney was saying, and then all the news stories coming out of that was that all of a sudden Romney was surging as a result of the first debate. And so I have a colleague, Brendan Nyan, who put together a graph that looks at this, and what you can see basically is that this just sort of averages the polls, from sort of September through October to where we are now. And what you can see is that the movement towards Obama, I can't step over Professor Just here, but the movement towards Obama really started happening, towards Romney, really started happening before the first debate ever happened, right? So generally what you see is if we extended this graph through the summer, you would have seen a race that was neck and neck through most of the summer, and then the party conventions happened. And during the party conventions, you always see each party getting a bump, right? So the Republican Party got a bump out of its convention because they were on national TV for a few nights in a row, and then after the Democratic National Convention at the very beginning of September, the Democrats got a big bump, and then the race sort of widened at that point. So the gap that Obama had gotten out of the first bump, he was able to widen and maintain through the month of September. But then, as we see with most elections, and we could sort of have a graph that's very similar to this for 2008, for 2004, for lots of other years, what you see is there starts to be a convergence, back towards the middle, because there's kind of a regression to the mean, in a sense, right? The candidate that's doing well starts to drop a little, the candidate that's doing poorly starts to go up a little. And that regression really happened before the first debate, and the first debate simply reinforced what was already going on, right? And then that movement together sort of continued through the first debate, and they've pretty much been neck and neck through most of October. But all the talk that you have recently about Romney surging and Obama slowing down, it's really based on it's a very, very small movement in the poll averages. And so, the race really right now is really quite close. And I think most political scientists would argue that while the first debate was important, it wasn't decisive in the same way that I think a lot of the news stories are making it out to be. Second point I wanted to make is, whenever you hear what's going on in the campaign from the news, it would seem like all that's going on in the campaign, aside from debates and things like that, are the ads, right? It's all about the ad wars. It's all about sort of the news stories that are coming out. And one of the points that I want to make today is that one of the most underreported aspects of this year's campaign, and I think many, many campaigns very often, is the importance of the ground game. And what I mean by the ground game is the boots on the ground, the foot soldiers. These are people that are out knocking on doors and organizing their communities to try to turn people out to vote, to try to get them to support their own candidate. And one way of looking at the importance of the ground game is, this is a graph that basically shows the gap, in 2008, the gap between the outcome that Obama and McCain were predicted to get and the actual outcome they got in a number of key swing states in 2008, right? So this is 4 years ago, and basically these are all states, because they were swing states, there were a ton of people, a ton of different organizations that were polling in the week before the election, right? And so we're able to sort of aggregate those polls and say, on average, Obama was predicted to get 47% or 48% or however much of the vote in each of these key states. And then what actually happened on election day is always slightly different from what the polls predicted. And so basically what this graph shows is the blue line shows the gap between the prediction for Obama and what he actually was able to achieve on election day, and the red bars show the gap between what was predicted for McCain and what he was actually able to achieve, okay? And so looking at this graph, right, what you should see is that on average, Obama was able to beat his poll numbers by more than McCain was, right? And there were actually a couple instances where McCain actually did worse than what the polls predicted. And the only exception to that is West Virginia and New Hampshire, where those are the two states where McCain actually did better than Obama in those poll numbers. And one way to think about this difference is that the difference between Obama and McCain and their ability to beat the poll numbers can really be about the ground game, right? Because what ends up happening is, as with all things in life, right, in politics there's a gap between intention and action. And so what people tell pollsters is different from what they actually do, right? So they might say, definitely going to vote for McCain, I'll definitely be out there on election day, and then not actually go out and vote, or vice versa, right? But the Obama campaign, because of their field organization, because of their ground game, they were able to actually turn people out and make sure that they could sort of get that base out to vote. So just one way to represent that is this next graph. Basically, it tracks the difference between Obama and McCain. So these purple bars all show, how much was Obama able to beat his poll numbers relative to how much was McCain able to beat his poll numbers. And if you compare that to the number of field offices they had in each state, what you see is that the green bars show the ratio, the number of field offices that Obama had versus McCain had. And what you see is that Obama on average had way more field offices on the ground, like way more offices open than McCain did, and especially in the states where he did really well, he he far outstripped McCain. And again, one of the states that McCain won was West Virginia, which is one of the few states where McCain actually had more field offices than Obama. And the one anomaly in this pattern is New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the one state where Obama actually did have more field offices than McCain, but McCain still won the ground game. He still won the election day advantage. And so the point to take away from that basically is that that when you have an election that's really, really close, or when you have an election that's really far apart, the ground game isn't going to be decisive necessarily, right? Because the ground game can make you up a few points. But when you have an election that's really close like this, especially in a lot of the swing states, then that's where the ground game, or the ability to sort of turn people out to vote, can really make a big difference. And if you look at, I forgot to pull this up, but I won't show the graph, but if you look at the number of field offices that Obama and Romney have this year, in states like Ohio, the Democrats have opened up something like 130 field offices in Ohio, whereas the Republicans have something like 30, right? So they have almost 100 more field offices on the ground in states like Ohio than the Republicans do, and there are a number of states where the Republicans have 0 field offices, right? They're relying entirely on ads, on the national campaign in order to carry some of those states forward. And so it's a different kind of strategy that I think has different implications for in different elections. Okay, the last point that I wanted to make, is the last point I wanted to make is that a lot of people kind of ask this question of, okay, in 2008, when we looked back on that campaign, a lot of people said, well, one of the reasons why Obama won was because he was able to marshal the power of social media and online tools in a way that no candidate had ever been able to before, which is absolutely true. Like, he built a more sophisticated online infrastructure than other candidates had been able to before, and all subsequent campaigns have copied that, right? So a lot of the campaigns nowadays have a lot of the same tools that Obama had first started using in 2008. But a lot of the research that came out after 2008 was trying to probe that question. Okay, so how powerful were those online tools? Like, did they really make the difference in building the movement that Obama claimed to build? And the point that I want to make is that, in general, the research shows that the power of online tools is much, much, much more limited than old-fashioned kind of face-to-face contact. And in fact, if you talk to organizers in the Obama campaign themselves, they'll tell you the same thing. And what they'll say is that the online tools were really, really powerful in helping them to cast a much wider net than they'd ever been able to before, right? So in the past, if I was a campaign and I wanted to find supportive people, I'd have to go door to door and knock on people's doors and say, hi, are you supporting Democrats or Republicans today, right? Or I would have to call through and make phone calls to try to find people. So it's very, very time consuming. But with the internet, what the Obama campaign could do is set up a website, and then people who supported them would come to them, right? And all of a sudden they captured all their email addresses and all their information. And so they had this huge net, this huge pool of people from which they could draw to generate the activism that they needed. And so what the internet was able to do is increase the size of that pool, but in terms of getting people to actually take part and engage in activism, the organizers themselves will tell you it was the face-to-face contact, right? It was the fact that they still had all these field offices open where they were talking to people face-to-face and getting them engaged. And so political scientists have done a bunch of studies comparable to this, where they looked at the effect of different kinds of communication mediums on turnout, basically. So these are experimental studies where basically, political scientists love this, because until recently we haven't been able to do a lot of field experiments because you can't really run like an experimental war or an experimental election or something like that. But one thing we can do is sort of experiment with different ways of trying to get people out, right? And so in these experiments, they would do things like randomize people in the treatment and control groups, and people in the treatment group would get an email saying, urging them to turn out to vote, whereas people in the control group would get nothing. Or they would sort of, people in the treatment group might get exposed to a certain kind of TV ad that would encourage them to get involved, and people in the control group would not. And we wanted to see what the effect of those different things were. And what this graph shows is if you average across a number of different studies that have been done, that on average, the effect of email on getting people to turn out or take some kind of political action is 0. Right? This is average across a bunch of studies. The effect of TV ads is somewhere around 0.3 to 0.5%. The effect of phone calls ranges anywhere from like 2 to 5% about, And then the effect of face-to-face contact can go anywhere from 5% up to a maximum of 18% is the largest effect that we've seen, right? And so if you are thinking about ways to get involved and you want to make a difference for any kind of candidate or any campaign or ballot measure that's out there, the best thing you can do is to volunteer to engage in this kind of face-to-face contact, because that's the one thing that's going to make a difference way more than any of the other forms of online activism that we see today. So I'll stop there and give it to Professor Cushman.
Hello, thanks for coming. I am glad to be here. I'm the only non-political scientist present, so I can always claim that I just don't know enough to make about politics to make any statements that resonate with you. But maybe some of the things I have to say reflect my own looking at this election at a more macro level at some of the larger scale cultural and social forces that are swirling about the election. Personally, I'll admit that, that although I really feel terrible about the hurricane and the damage it wrought, one of the nicest things is that the pundits went off the air for a couple of days. We didn't have to look at the kind of talking heads, the incessant kind of back and forth between the talking heads. That's one of the things I want to talk about today, about the quality of our public discourse. But before I do that, it just occurred to me to mention something that might be of interest to you about a possible outcome of the election that you probably haven't thought of. It was based on an article I read yesterday by a constitutional scholar at Berkeley by the name of John Yoo, who some of you might know, not necessarily in a positive sense, had worked for the Bush administration, writing the memos that authorized the use of torture, I guess you could say, to interrogate prisoners. But he is a constitutional scholar, and he said, well, here's an outcome that I bet you nobody's thought of. Romney-Biden. Maybe the political scientists are already saying, I know that. According to the 12th Amendment, if the Electoral College comes out as a tie, then the Congress decides who gets to be the president and the vice president. And the way that works is that the House of Representatives gets to vote for the president, and the Senate gets to vote for the vice president. So if the election comes out as a tie, there are three conditions: as a tie in the Electoral College, and the House stays Republican, then they vote for Romney for president, and the Senate stays Democrat, and then they vote for Biden. And we have a Romney-Biden ticket, which is interesting, to say the least. I'm not sure how that would work out, really. But and then, of course, the idea is what would happen if that was the case. And then the right kind of kicked in and said, well, the best thing to do would be for Biden to take himself out and not create division. I have a hard time thinking that would happen, but in any case, let's not make this about Biden and Romney and the 12th Amendment. But I thought that was interesting. I'm always looking for these curious outcomes that could take place, because it's going to be very close. I'd also like to say something before we go about talking about politics in the academic sector, especially in this election period. It's, many people are looking at the public sphere, and they're getting a sense that it's very polarized and very intense sometimes, and I'll be talking about that primarily. I just wanted to say that when you're talking about this election, it's important to know that something about the context of the people who might be listening. And there was a poll done a couple of years ago now that I think is a pretty good poll about the attitudes of faculty and the political affiliations of faculty. And Wellesley's faculty polled out at 23 Democrats to 1 Republican. And I think in the student body, by my guess, it's probably more like 10 to 1. That would be my best guess. I don't have survey data, although there always is Survey Monkey or something. I could probably do something like that. Actually, an anomaly of that was Smith College comes in at 8 to 1. I don't know why that is. I mean, it seems, it must be because its location, there must be some Yankee libertarians kind of lurking on the faculty or just kind of being quiet until they get surveyed and they say, yes, Republican. And they don't actually tell anybody, because that would be kind of, problematic in a homogeneous sphere. But so I think that in that context, I'm glad to be here. I'm not affiliated, although I have strong views on certain things. The first thing I'd like to say is that for me, that this election, at the most macro level sense, seems to embody what I consider to be a struggle between two very important and very distinguished traditions in American history, and that would be between collectivism and individualism. I'll start with individualism. You know, it's very clear that the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights in particular, is a constitution of what we call in human rights negative rights, or individual rights, in which specify what the state can't do to you. And in some ways, that had been the major tradition of the United States in terms of protecting against the state. But with the rise of this is a very truncated view, obviously, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the shifting of populations from agrarian to industrial, the concentrations of people in cities, these are kinds of things that sociologists look at, the consequences of modernity, the consequences of industrialization. The state began to play a much more active role in the administration of human affairs, probably by necessity. If you have millions of people living in cities, an individual rights regime just doesn't kind of work. It's very anarchic, and you need to have public health, and the state has to run that. So the state takes in the progressive tradition, which emerges in the late 19th century and through the 20th century, especially crystalline in the New Deal and continuing on with the welfare state. The state takes on a very important steering function for different kinds of rights, social and economic rights, which are not in the Constitution per se. I mean, some people have argued that they are, but they're just not there. And those primarily were pushed via legislation, presidential initiatives, and all of that. But I think it's very important to take the actors out of this in some senses and look at this as a struggle between these two different philosophies of government. And there was a point in the first debate which I'll say more about in a minute, but that I just thought of reading in relation to this as Hahrie was talking. I looked it up, where Jim Lehrer says, asked the question, do you believe, both of you, and he said, wait, do you believe there's a fundamental difference between the two of you as to how you view the mission of the federal government? You know what the answer is going to be, but let me tell you what they said if you don't remember. I remember saying at the time to someone I was watching it with that particular moment seemed to me to be an embodiment of this tension that I was just talking about between collectivism, state involvement versus libertarianism on the other side. Obama says the first role of the federal government is to keep the American people safe, which is part of the Constitution, and that nobody would qualm with that the most legitimate function of the state in a libertarian view is national defense. That's its most basic function. As commander-in-chief, I've worked on that. And then here you can already see the shift. I also believe that government has the capacity, the federal government has the capacity to help open up opportunity and create ladders of opportunity and to create frameworks where the American people can succeed. This is not, as far as I would argue this with somebody, maybe in a longer debate, that this is not essentially a constitutional idea. The equality of opportunity is obviously, equality under the law is certainly in the Constitution, but it's questionable about whether opportunity is there. And then he goes on, and this is Obama, quotes Abraham Lincoln, there are some things we do better together. So in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said, let's help to finance the Transcontinental Railroad, let's start the National Academy of Science, let's start land-grant colleges, because we want to give these gateways of opportunity. This does not restrict people's freedom, this enhances it. And this is a very powerful kind of social economic rights idea, that you free people by giving them the infrastructure by which they can realize their autonomy and their agency and their individuality. Whereas there's really not much said about that in the Constitution. So it goes on, and basically the idea is the federal government does play an active role. And then Romney comes and what his view of the government is. And of course he comes out and he says, well, we need a strong military because that's what the state is supposed to do. But he says the role of the government is look behind us. This is interesting, look behind us. Go back to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The role of the government is to promote and protect the principles of those documents, which if you look at the documents, they're especially the Bill of Rights, it's pure libertarianism. That's what it is. If you look at libertarian platforms now, they're almost all stated in terms of what the Bill of Rights says. So, and again, the term libertarian gets, in my mind, a bad rap. But that's because they're looking at libertarians, modern libertarians who are sometimes much different than, say, Jefferson or someone like that. But so he says, we are endowed by our Creator with rights. We have to commit to religious tolerance and freedom, et cetera, et cetera. We are all children of the same God. We care for those that have difficulties. But then this is where he says, we also believe in maintaining for individuals the right to pursue their dreams and not to have the government substitute itself for the rights of free individuals. And what we are seeing now is, in my view, a trickle-down government approach, which has government thinking it can do a better job than free people pursuing their dreams, and it's not working. So that little interchange was very telling, it seems to me, about the larger macro-level scale of very legitimate traditions in the American political history. It seems to me it's that, you know, for people who are individualists, radical libertarians say, when they hear the word collectivism, they immediately assume socialism, Marxism, communism. And you hear this very often among radical libertarians on that side, saying that Obama's a socialist, Obama's a communist, Obama's a Marxist. I never could quite figure that one out. He never talks about Marx. But all those kinds of epithets. But that ignores the idea that he may be working out legitimately of the progressive collectivist tradition in the United States, in which the state is seen as a major institution for forging social justice and different kinds of rights. And conversely, collectivists on the fringe, who are way out there, or maybe people who are, say, on the fringe of, say, Occupy Wall Street or something like that. It's like Tea Party on one side, Occupy Wall Street on the other. You know, when they hear the word individualism, they think egoism, self-interest, you don't care about anybody, no community. And that can be a caricature as well of that side. So, you know, I think that it's important to understand, if you want to analyze this macro level conditioning factor on the election, is to understand that there are very important, I think, well-regarded and reasonable traditions of individualism and collectivism. And I think what we're seeing in this election is a struggle between those two sometimes incommensurable points of view. You know, the question is whether or not collectivism or, you know, a kind of Rawlsian liberal approach on the one hand is commensurate with a kind of libertarian individual rights tradition on the other hand is, for me, one of the biggest issues that we face in the public discourse. And I wish that it could be carried on more in terms of that struggle, because there's an attempt on either side to kind of delegitimate the other side. So if you start talking about individual rights, the polarization process begins, and you're thrown over into the Tea Party wing. And if you start talking about state involvement in human affairs and steering towards social justice, you're kind of thrown into the Occupy Wall Street side of the wing. And as you watch, this is what I'll get to in terms of talking about the media, as you watch some of the debates that go on television, for instance, there doesn't seem to be any kind of middle ground between those two things. You have the major networks kind of staking out their territory, and what you have, say, if you take, like, for instance, I find it interesting, especially on campus here, because I have a student who was on Fox News Network for 20 minutes talking about her research over the summer, and I tried to get the college to publicize that, and they wouldn't do it. Why? Because it's Fox, you know? You know? I'm not sure that's the favorite channel at Wellesley College. Now, what if she had been on NBC, MSNBC, not NBC is okay, they're kind of, you know, the MSNBC, which is, for me, from my point of view, the mirror image of Fox, just in the other way. You know, and of course you may not see that if you agree with everything that everybody says on MSNBC. But if you take those two stations as examples of media outlets where you see a certain kind of public discourse, it reflects this polarization very well. And that people who tune into one or the other channel, this is, I think, a really crucial point, they're not tuning in to get perspective that might challenge what they believe. They're tuning in to get reaffirmation of what they already believe. So, if you don't like Obama, and you think he's a pretender, and you think he never should have been elected president, and you think he's arrogant, and you think all those things, then you tune in to listen to Hannity. Not O'Reilly, because Hannity is even farther over, if you actually take the time to watch. If you look at the rhetoric, it's much more, I'm not trying to give a pass to Bill O'Reilly, but in terms of the intensity of the rhetoric, it's very severe. And if you think that Romney's a fraud and Romney's a fake and a hollow man and is a liar and flip-flops and all that kind of thing, you tune in to Chris Matthews and he'll tell you that. And so what happens is you have, large numbers of people, depending on what their audiences are, who are actually not engaged in a public discourse in which there's interchanges of ideas, but they're actually in echo chambers, in which they only hear, they either confirm their own ideas or hear the words that they already believe echoed back to them when they speak to them. And it seems to me that the real problem in public discourse these days, and this is something that sociologists do study, the public sphere we call it, is the fact that we don't necessarily have a kind of John Stuart Millsian picture or utopian vision of the public sphere, which is a free marketplace of ideas. We actually have a lot of different, we don't have a public sphere where that goes on. We have lots of little spherecules, little spheres, which people go into, and when they go into them, and this is kind of a raw metaphor, I agree, but they go into these, and maybe I'm mixing my metaphors, they're sphericals in which people enter into, and then they just speak words, and those words are echoed back and forth to them, and there's not much chance for the words to go out and circulate around, or for people to entertain ideas that actually might challenge their points of view. It's a very disturbing trend in politics, it seems to me, this kind of polarization, and I think the media really does kind of feed into it because it sets the pace. If you turn on the television and one channel is one echo chamber and the other one is another echo chamber, if you're a student, then you might think, well, I'll just tune into the one that makes me feel, if you're learning about political discourse, you might tune into the one that makes you feel better. If I did a poll in this audience, how many of you watch Fox News or Bill O'Reilly? A couple of people. Was that? They don't get it, they don't get, you don't get cable, right?
They don't get.
Oh, lucky you, you're spared all this. I mean, forget about that. But in fact, you might tune into these things and you'll get a very skewed idea, kind of polarized idea. And here's another example, and I don't want to pick on him because he's not present, and we've also had a nice conversation about it, but it was when E.J. Dionne came to Wellesley's campus, and was the Wilson lecturer. Well, that's very nice. He's a distinguished Washington Post columnist. Well, he came ostensibly to talk about polarization in American discourse and then blamed the conservatives for it. Of course, if you bring a liberal commentator in to talk about polarization, and they're going to, and he's not talking about it, he blames the other side. If you had brought in a conservative commentator, he might have blamed the liberal side. And I don't think that's very productive in that sense. Yeah, we didn't time it just right, folks. Sorry.
I get the last licks here. I'm just going to stand up over here and see if I can find my... Okay, well, prediction is a very, as you know, a very dangerous game. And my favorite commentator when it comes to prediction is Nate Silver, who is a young man who got his start predicting baseball and never went to do political science in college, but somehow ended up in the prediction of presidential elections business. He did so well that the New York Times hired him to do their blog. And so I have cribbed this from Nate Silver's blog, in which he shows you in the first column what he forecast last June. That's the extreme left column for various states, swing states. And then the middle column is what he forecast for those same states after several months of the election. And the net change is in the extreme right-hand column, and I'll just read down some of the numbers: plus 2.3 for Romney, plus 1.2 for Obama, plus 1.6 for Romney, plus 4.2 for Romney, plus 3.8 for Obama. Basically, very little change in these numbers between June and October. Here these poor candidates have been campaigning their hearts out, and what do they get? 2% up in a state. So not only that, but they have been spending an enormous amount of money trying to get those little 1 or 2% of net change. And the reason that Nate Silver published this particular table here is that he wanted you to know that you could do pretty well in the prediction business without actually paying any attention to the campaign. And the net gains were, as one might expect, since Romney was far behind, Romney did better in trying to make up some of the lost ground. So some political scientists have argued, do campaigns matter at all? Gary King from Harvard, a very quantitative political scientist, says all that happens in the campaign basically is that people sort themselves into the right boxes by the end of the campaign. So they would have been heading in those directions anyway, and they finally get there at the end of the campaign. So I just wanted to, let's see, I seem to have skipped something here. Just to tell you, though, that candidates and their campaigns behave as if political scientists know nothing, which is probably a safe bet for them. And so they decide to spend everything they can to get those little tiny 2% and 3% changes. Now, obviously, you would think they would have to spend less money when they were well ahead or well behind, but that rarely happens. And we also are worried, very much worried this particular presidential cycle, about the decision in Citizens United, which was argued would open the floodgates of money to be spent in the campaign primarily by corporations and their conservative super PACs on the Republican side. And as you can see from all of this, if you look at the total going across, this was not true. The floodgates did open up, but pretty much balanced out between the Democratic and Republican teams as they are portrayed here in the Open Secrets document. Now, they're each spending about $1 billion on their campaigns. This was finished up through October 17th, some of it, and the rest was a few days later. So we're not done, and probably each campaign will spend about $1 billion. And that includes what the candidates spent from donations that they raised, what the national party spent, and as you can see, the national party spent about the same amount of money on both sides. The Democrats raised more money than the Republicans in terms of the candidate category. However, as expected, the outside funding, right, that's the super PACs and so forth, were 3 times as much on the Republican side as the Democratic side. But in the end, the Democratic donors came through to balance out roughly $1 billion on each side. So we have to worry. This huge floodgate of money is out there. It's washing us away just like Hurricane Sandy, but it seems actually more balanced than was foretold. Now, what were they spending all this money on? They must have a theory, right? They must have a theory about what to spend it on. And as you can see from this pie chart that I created here based on some data from Open Secrets, the biggest chunk of that pie is spent on that great dark blue. That's not Wellesley. It's the dark blue for media. So that piece of the pie overwhelms everything else that they're spending in the campaigns. And that shouldn't come as a big shock. Also, if you own a TV station this year, boy, are you making out like a bandit, as that's where the money is going. So it never used to be such a great job, but boy, if you have enough money to buy one, I'd get into that the next presidential election cycle. Anyway, other things, administration, campaign expenses, yard signs, fundraising, all of that are smaller parts. And if we look at the, sorry to do this to you, at what they're spending, the media chunk, if we break down the media chunk, we see, I've bolded, the broadcast media. So this is TV ads, okay? This huge amount is TV ads, and miscellaneous is everything else. Internet media is only half of that. Media consultants, by the way, also doing quite well this year. You wonder what they do. Well, they tell you where to place the ads, and, by the way, get a percentage of the ad buy in every time they place an ad. So there is, if you're thinking of going into politics, this is the way to go, right? You get to do good and make out real well. Okay, so this is, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ad wars, let's see if I can. They closed the campaigns by making statements about themselves. No surprise there. And is it going to start? No. Here we go. Go, 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 go. How do we get it to go?
Sometimes it takes a minute to go.
Oh, okay.
It might be buffering.
Oh, it might be buffering? Oh,
Yeah.
good. Well, I'm glad.
Do you want the sound?
Yeah.
One is a path represented by the president, which at the end of 4 years would mean we'd have $20 trillion in debt, heading towards Greece. I'll get us on track to a balanced budget. The president's path will mean continuing declining in take-home pay. I want to make sure take-home pay turns around and starts to grow. The president's path means 20 million people out of work, struggling for a good job. I'll get people back to work with 12 million new jobs. I'm going to make sure that we get people off of food stamps, not by cutting the program, but by getting them good jobs. America's going to come back, and for that to happen, we're going to have a president who can work across the aisle. I'll work with you. I'll lead you in an open and honest way, and I ask for your vote. I'd like to be the next president of the United States to support and help this great nation, and to make sure that we all together maintain America as the hope of the earth.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
Okay. So this was probably one of the cheapest ads they produced in the entire campaign, because all they did was to take tape from the debates and rerun it. And if you want to do a cheap ad, that's the way to go, right? It's often, and I think that they felt they had a very effective pitch in the debate, and that this was the best time to reinforce the kind of debate rhetoric by making this their last positive ad. Not that they've been having so many positive ads to compare this one with. Neither candidate has. They've both been doing negative ads, which is what we often think of when we think of advertising in a campaign. Let me see if we can find the other one.
The Detroit Auto Show with my dad. That was a big deal. How in the world did an industry and its leaders and its unions get in such a fix that they lost jobs, that they lost their future? President Obama did all these things the liberals have wanted to do for years. And the fact that you've got millions of Americans out of work, home values collapsing, people here in Detroit are distressed. I want to make Michigan stronger and better. Michigan's been my home, and this is personal. I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
So that was a very soft attack ad, right? It's like, look at this wretched city. We know whom to blame for that, and I'm going to fix that because I grew up here. So that's kind of a, you know, if you have to have a negative ad, that's kind of a nice one. The one that I was looking for, let's see if I can find it.
You're seeing that right now. Over 5 million new jobs. Exports up 41%. Home values rising. Our auto industry back. And our heroes are coming home. We're not there yet, but we've made real progress. And the last thing we should do is turn back now. Here's my plan for the next 4 years. Making education and training a national priority. Building on our manufacturing goal. Boosting American-made energy. Reducing the deficits responsibly by cutting where we can and asking the wealthy to pay a little more. And ending the war in Afghanistan so we can do some nation building here at home. That's the right path. So read my plan, compare it to Governor Romney's, and decide which is better for you. It's an honor to be your president, and I'm asking for your vote. So together, we can keep moving America forward. I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
So that was the Obama closing positive ad. Some people said this was about 9 months too late, that he didn't come out early enough with a statement about what he stood for in terms of what he had accomplished, and that it was about time that he said so. He was also being pressured by the Romney 5-point plan, and he has a 5-point plan too, so now we have matching 5-point plans, and you can all, you know, if you're a communist, you may want a 5-year plan. We don't get to work. So anyway, this was the 2 pitches that they made. And it seems a shame that it took so long for Obama to identify what it was that he stood for and was going to emphasize at the end. I think he's one of these people who thinks it's obvious to him and that he therefore doesn't need to explain it to us. He also did something else in this ad that Tip O'Neill would have really admired. He was a politician from Massachusetts, and he said that he was walking down the street one day, and he, right after the election, and he said to one of his constituents, "Did you vote for me in the election?" And she said, "No, I didn't." And he said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Because you never asked." So Obama is taking that as quite seriously, that piece of political advice, and asking for your vote, which is humbling and shows his humble side. If you notice that honesty also was something that both candidates are after, and that's because probably although character, I just want to argue that point, that character is not important in presidential elections. By that, I think we mean who the president is having an affair with is not probably that relevant, except to the president's spouse. But character comes across in a different way, and that is the most important trait of a president. The two most important ones are leadership, and Romney has done quite well on that, and trust, and Romney has not done so well on that. Obama has the leadership symbols of office, but he doesn't necessarily project all of that, except when we have problems abroad or a hurricane. And yet he seems to also be coming out ahead on the trust factor. So trust is actually an important element of how people feel in a campaign. And that part of what the campaign does is show us whether or not the candidate can be trusted. And if that is something that voters care a great deal about, maybe not quite as much as they care about their pocketbooks. But it also, when we think about pocketbooks, it's also not just what they have now, but what they think they're going to have that matters. And at the moment, Americans are somewhat optimistic. So this may come as a surprise, and I think that both candidates were surprised. Governor Romney felt that he could run on look how terrible things are, and things have gotten modestly better. And President Obama thought he could run on I'm the president and I've done a good job, which was apparent to him. But in fact, and that the other side was very radical. But apparently, as soon as the debate started, we discovered that the radicalism that had driven Romney to the right during the primaries had disappeared, and now he was making his pitch to the center. I think that it was not just that Obama was an empty chair or catatonic during that first debate. I think he was just sitting there saying, "What?" And he couldn't process the fact that he was now running against a different candidate. Okay, we got to wrap up because the time is 9, and I hope that the best man wins. Unfortunately, this time we can't say the best woman, but...
Can we just once again thank all of our panelists?